Marta snatched her hand back when the glyphs shifted under her fingertip. Her breath made a white smear in the candle glow. The archivist leaned forward and felt suspicion tighten his jaw. He could not ignore the way the inked strokes reoriented themselves when Marta tried to trace a line. The manuscript lay open between them on the scriptorium table, its vellum rimmed with old soot and a faint iron scent. Whoever had written that book had not arranged letters for linear eyes. The codex resisted every attempt at normal reading, and that refusal framed the day's problem with blunt clarity. The archivist, aged 45, hair pulled back into a loose knot, ink staining several fingertips, moved a magnifying lens into the pool of light. He did not speak at first. He watched a single glyph slide laterally along the page by less than a millimeter and stop, as if bracketed by an invisible hinge. Marta hissed. Marta, it moved again. Did you see it, archivist? He answered with a slow nod. Archivist. I see it. Keep copying. The exchange was terse. The room was not large. Shelves rose like stacked coffins. A lamp tilted on its stand. A thin trail of smoke curved toward the ceiling. For a moment, action and observation replaced speculation. The central problem lay exposed. The codex rejected human reading protocols and seemed to alter itself in presence of human attention. He introduced his background in the few sentences forced by work. The archivist had catalogued marginalia for 2 decades, catalogue numbers scrawled on slips, the habit of placing a thumb against brittle pages to steady them. He had the brass astrolabe on a chain, fingerless gloves, signet rings engraved with minute marginal notations. Those objects marked him in colleagues' eyes as careful and conservative. He could lose reputation for claiming danger where others found only age. Still, the manuscript presented a threat to method and to safety that appealed to his suspicion and pushed him to act. Curator Ria me to wait. Brother Elias, when they moved to the archive chamber, his voice clipped by worry. Brother Elias. If this is dangerous, we burn it or lock it away. Ria stood with folded arms. Curator Rihir. We catalogue first. We do not destroy until we know what we have. The archivist set the codex on a padded board and slid the protective covering back. He, archivist. Provenance suggests late 12th century. Binding inconsistent with known workshops, he meant the statement to be neutral. It landed as defiance. The room shifted. Colleagues weighed curiosity against institutional rules, and the archivist felt the first emotion shift. Suspicion to guarded urgency. They walked the reader through provenance in short, concrete lines. Brother Elias tapped the accession slip. Brother Elias. Found in the east wing beneath a false floor, labeled in a hand that resembles no local scribe. Marta, who had copied marginalia earlier, said, Marta. The ink smells different, metallic with a hint of resin. My hands burned where I traced the margin. The archivist recorded each claim on a fresh folio, fingers moving with a practiced steadiness. Ria, Curator Ria. Are you suggesting the book is active? He answered, Archivist. I am suggesting it resists our reading methods. We must test reading protocols. The debate tightened. Curiosity and fear pulled against each other. They tried the first transliteration. The archivist and Brother Elias sat side by side at the analysis table. Marta copied the marginalia into a ledger. They worked in short turns and voice lines punctuated the effort. Brother Elias. Read the second line aloud. Archivist. No, read slowly and mark each stroke. The man read. Midway, Marta straightened and said, Marta. The copied line rearranged on my page. She closed her eyes and steadied herself against the table. Nausea pushed at her cheeks. The copied ink curved on the paper toward a point that did not exist on the original folio. The room smelled of iron again. That physical reaction moved the emotion shift. Guarded urgency gave way to alarm. Brother Elias rubbed his forehead with a damp cloth. Brother Elias. I felt pressure behind my eyes, he said. Brother Elias. Like someone leaning from behind. Ria narrowed her eyes. Curator Ria. This is exactly why we must not experiment, she said. Her tone hardened. The archivist inhaled. He felt the weight of possible ruin. He watched Marta's hands tremble and chose to press forward. He did not explain that he believed the manuscript might require action, not translation. He only said, Archivist. We overlay the marginalia and look for pattern. He set pins at page corners and laid transparent sheets over the margin marks. Rhea used a slide rule to align symbols. When she overlaid 3 marginal sets, an angular pattern emerged. Curator Rhea. "This is not commentary," she said, voice low. Curator Rhea. "These marks form a directive, like an instruction sequence." The archivist traced the pattern with his fingertip. His skin felt colder where the ink met vellum. He tapped his thumb against a marginal note, then stopped. "Archivist. If this is a ritual, it asks to be practiced, not read," he said. The team shifted again. Cautious preservationists on one side, the archivist leaning toward action on the other. Rhea's jaw tightened. Curator Rhea. "That is reckless, archivist." "We can control variables," he countered. They prepared a controlled reading. The archivist assigned roles with economy. Marta would copy while wearing gloves. Brother Elias would watch the room's entrance. Rhea would document with black charcoal sketches rather than ink. The night grew thin and colder as they made lists and placed brass weights at page corners. The archivist tied the astrolabe to his chain and laid it on the table, a measured emblem of method. He heard Rhea ask, "Curator Rhea, if you go on, will you accept the archive's decision?" He answered, "Archivist. I will accept what the manuscript reveals." That answer contained a mission. He intended to continue even if the archive forbade it. They began the ritual. The archivist spoke the first line from the overlay sequence in a clipped monotone. Brother Elias repeated the syllable. Marta kept her hands a hair above the page and traced nothing but watched the script. At first nothing happened. Then letters rearranged in midair, ink strokes slid like thin tacks being nudged. Marta gasped and doubled over. "Marta. I see shapes, no angles, inside my head," she said. She clutched at her collar and vomited onto the stone floor. Brother Elias grabbed her elbows and hauled her back to the bench. Rhea flung open the chamber door and shouted, "Curator Rhea, stop this now!" The ritual collapsed into a scramble. That external event pushed stakes upward and introduced immediate physical harm. Marta lay with her forehead on the table, breath fast. "Marta. My sight," those lines bent into a spiral. Her words broke. Brother Elias stood with a hand at her back. "Brother Elias, we should stop. We should stop now." Rhea's face was pale. She stamped her foot and said, "Curator Rhea, you endangered a colleague." The archivist looked at the codex. The ink had rearranged itself into a spiral on the left hand folio. It suggested an aperture, a central void framed by words. He felt something inside him cleave. Professional embarrassment on one side, a rising determination on the other. He could not accept leaving the book as an unsolved object. That night, the archivist took the codex to his private study beneath the scriptorium. He locked the heavy door and set a single candle in a brass dish. He unrolled charts aligning marginal overlays with careful pins. The room smelled of old incense and cold stone. The astrolabe lay by his elbow. He sat alone. He would not repeat the ritual. He would observe. He placed his gloved finger at the page edge. The glyphs began to rotate into a configuration he had not seen before. And then the folio resolved into a sequence that seemed to address his field of vision specifically. He felt the second emotion shift. Determination curdled into a brittle curiosity that twinged at his temples. Words do not exist to describe what he saw next. The glyphs did not spell syllables. They arranged into an instruction that relied on his act of looking to complete itself. A pressure pushed at the back of his eyes. He did not hear a voice, and yet something like an imperative formed in the center of his perception and fixed on him. He fumbled for a pen and drew the configuration. The movement of his hand made the ink on the page flicker, as if reacting to his scrape. He paused, fingers trembling, and recorded the alignment in careful lines. He felt a faint sting at the inside of his left temple, the small crescent burn scar he carried, but the sensation had no heat. It felt like a brief recognition. He began to read the instruction aloud to test whether the book required vocalization. He spoke 2 short phrases and kept his throat open, measured, "Archivist." 1. Hold the gaze. 2. Do not close your eyes. The codex rearranged its notation into a face, like aperture. He felt his vision narrow. He realized the manuscript focused on a narrower, more specific perceptual register than mere language. The book was teaching a ritual of seeing. He forced himself to exhale and to name the problem out loud. The codex demanded a change in how perception was sequenced. When he returned in the morning to the archived chamber, Rhea held the drawing he had left on the desk. "Curator Rhea, you scribbled this last night and did not say why," she said. "Curator Rhea, you put our colleagues at risk." Brother Elias looked away from Rhea and toward the locked stacks. "Brother Elias, the pages rearranged again after you left," he said. Marta sat with both hands bandaged. Her voice was flat. "Marta, I had a vision of angled corridors. I heard a click like metal shifting, the room's energy constricted." The archivist delivered a careful report of what he had recorded. He kept his voice even. He did not reveal the exact impression the manuscript had given him during the private reading. He knew that naming it would change the way others saw the book. He also knew that secrecy would fracture the team. An unexpected rearrangement occurred that morning. Brother Elias had left for water and returned to find the manuscript's lines reorganized into a spiral that resembled an aperture. He set the folio on the table, voice thin. "Brother Elias, look at this." I came back and the lines were different. He had his hand on the edge of the page. Marta and Rhea came to the table at once. "Marta, Marta, the spiral looks like a face." My nausea returned when I looked. Rhea drew her sleeve across her mouth and said nothing. The spiral forced the team to accept that the codex enacted change even under lock. The shift redefined the ontology of the book. It was not a passive object. They argued. The argument was fast and ragged. "Curator Rhea, lock it away." Rhea, archivist, "No. We can learn methodically." "Brother Elias, you risk us all." Elias shot back, archivist. "I will limit exposure," he replied. "Curator Rhea, you cannot decide alone." "Marta, we already decided to test once." "Marta." The exchange consisted of short lines, each naming the speaker to keep clarity. The rapid back and forth lasted 6 lines and ended with Rhea slamming a hand onto the ledger. The confrontation left bruises on their working relationships and pushed the narrative toward a critical decision. Against Rhea's cautions and Elias's protests, the archivist organized a controlled ritual reading with stricter safeguards. He wrote out roles again and assigned watch periods. He made Brother Elias responsible for the door, Marta for the page handling, and Rhea for documentation. He also prepared a private protocol, a sequence of images he would test alone in the study. The group stood at the scriptorium center before dawn, candles guttering. The archivist set the codex in a circle of brass weights and spoke short invocations from the marginal overlay. He felt the manuscript rearrange and then leap. Marta collapsed as the book emitted a visual rearrangement, and a field of angled geometry broke into her vision. Brother Elias scrambled, and Rhea burst through the doorway to witness the breakdown. The collapse fractured the group and produced physical injury. In the immediate aftermath, Rhea pushed the codex away with both hands. "Curator Rhea, we stop now. We close this book and we seal it," she said. Brother Elias was shaking. "Brother Elias, I don't want to go near it again." Marta sat white-faced as Elias wrapped her bandaged hands. The archivist looked at the spiral in the book, then at his colleagues. He chose to record the alignment in a private folio and to continue in secret. He slid a page into a portfolio and tucked it beneath his satchel. He spoke to no one while he did it. The decision converted fear and group cohesion into a fractured pact and set his course toward further obsession. Left alone at dawn, the archivist returned to the codex. He placed it on his lap in the private study and watched the glyphs align into a non-linear message that seemed to fixate on his perception. The impression reached beyond sight. It arrived as a pattern of instructions that involved timing, pupil dilation, and micro-adjustments of head angle. The book presented demands. Perform these motions. Maintain this cadence. Do not blink at the implied moment. He felt the apex of the chapter wash over him. The manuscript appeared to address him directly. He obeyed a single instruction. He angled his head and traced a marginal note with 2 fingertips. The glyphs resolved into a lattice that centered on a small emblem resembling a closed eye. The sensation was precise. A faint pressure behind the left temple, and a clarity of orientation that did not belong to memory but to present sense. He understood, with an unwelcome clearness, that the codex required a change in perceptual habit to be read. The confrontation forced him to confront whether comprehension demanded becoming another kind of observer. His hand began to shake. He steadied himself by speaking aloud. "Archivist, I will record this. I will not let it control me." The words sounded small in the stone room. He left the study as dawn light struck the high windows. In the archive chamber that morning, colleagues gathered with measured faces. Rhea checked inventory. Brother Elias kept his distance. Marta, bandaged, watched the archivist with a look that mixed accusation and worry. He handed a sealed folio to Rhea and said, "Archivist, keep this in the restricted ledger." Rhea took it, fingers pausing over the seal. "Curator Rhea, if you continue, you do it without us," she said. He did not answer. He moved to the cabinet, slid the codex into a locked drawer, and turned the key twice. He tucked his astrolabe into his satchel. That morning's closing moments resolved the chapter's mini-conflict. The group accounted for injuries and reputational risk. They imposed a formal restriction on the codex. Rhea filed a formal note. Brother Elias recorded his witness statement. Marta left with a bandaged hand and instructions to rest. The archivist, however, did not accept the closure. He recorded the alignment he had witnessed in private notes and chose to continue the work in secret. He packed a small satchel with the sealed folio, chalked a grid onto a spare page, and sat for a long minute polishing his spectacles with a corner of linen. He slid the emblem drawing into an inner pocket, felt the embossed grain of the paper, and closed the satchel with a decisive snap. He set the satchel beneath his robe and left the archive by a side stair leading to the old cellars. The last line of the chapter is his feet on the stone step as he descended, the key still warm in his palm. Emotion roots suspicion. Emotion shifts. Suspicion guarded urgency, alarm, brittle curiosity, determination. The chapter ends with a concrete action. He descended the side stairs, satchel secured, and locked the study door behind him. Marta lunged through the annex doorway and fell against the archivist, the codex clutched to her chest and its pages yawning like a wound. Suspicion hardened in the archivist's jaw. He had not expected a human body to react like a burned surface. Marta's breath hitched, and her fingers left pale trails on the manuscript's edge. The central problem sat between them. The book altered anyone who touched it, and the institution would demand containment. The archivist reached for Marta's wrist and felt the skin under her sleeve slick and cool. He had seen a warning before. Marta had snatched her hand back when the glyphs shifted under her fingertip in the earlier reading. Marta, breathed. Marta's reply was a ragged, single-word sound. The archivist's suspicion became urgent. He moved them both away from the doorway so the annex light would not flare on the pages. They were in the annex corridor outside the scriptorium, late at night. The archivist had left the lamp by the ledger and moved with practiced care, but the moment the codex cleared the threshold, the manuscript seemed to reassert itself. Marta's wrist was marked with a glossy sheen that reflected the candle flames in streaks. The archivist put a damp cloth to her skin and watched the ink pattern not fade but rearrange at the cloth's edge. He felt a shift. Doubt tightened his chest and then turned to alarm when the ink lifted into tiny ridges. "Elias is at the registry," Marta whispered between breaths. He saw the marginal axis change. The archivist flinched. Elias had been present for the controlled readings. The archivist remembered Elias leaning too close the night before, whispering about new alignments in the margins. Elias, the archivist, and then louder, "Elias, call the curator and the conservation team." Now the archivist's voice had a clipped authority that came from office and from knowledge. He would not wait on formalities. They reached the conservation examination room with the codex on Marta's lap. The curator stood by the table with her arms folded. Elias hovered with pale eyes and shaking hands. The archivist set the codex under the glass dome and watched the condensation form along its inside. The curator, "Quarantine," the archivist answered, "We need controlled observation." Elias cut in, "Controlled. Marta is showing the signs now," the curator repeated, "Quarantine." Immediately, a short argument followed with 3 rapid exchanges. "Curator, listen to me," the archivist. "If we seal it now, we lose the sequence. The sequence will kill someone," the curator replied. Marta already touched it. Elias, we are past safe containment. The archivist stepped closer to the dome and traced the rim with a gloved finger. His hands were steady, but his mouth went dry. Elias, what did you see last night when the marginalia aligned? Elias looked at the codex, then at Marta. A map, not a map of land, a map of orientation. It shifted when two people read separate margins at once. Elias's voice dropped. It formed a lattice. The curator's face tightened. We do not perform experiments. The archivist felt the old impulse swell. Curiosity layered over professional duty until the two blurred. That impulse was not abstract. It pulled him toward the codex with the same force that made him keep his spectacles on in the cold reading chamber. We can run a controlled protocol with minimal exposure. I will supervise. Marta will be monitored. Elias will be present as witness. The curator's eyes did not leave the dome. Elias shook his head no. Marta's skin, he lowered his voice. When I spoke the lines, it answered back. I felt like it was addressing me. The archivist felt alarm replace suspicion as Elias described the sensation. A pressure behind the teeth, and a geometry at the edge of vision that made language thin. They argued for 20 minutes, measured on the ticking clock above the archive door. The archivist proposed a sealed reading table with weighted gloves and a glass barrier that would capture the manuscript's output. The curator insisted on movers and records. Elias volunteered to hold Marta's hand during observation. The conversation escalated into a short, sharp sequence of clipped lines. The archivist and curator traded 3 quick objections and rebuttals before the curator finally nodded and agreed to a monitored trial. The controlled test took place in the reading chamber with the manuscript under a glass dome on a low table. The archivist set out instruments, the astrolabe on a chain, a scale of marginal notes, and a lamp that could be dimmed to a single wick. Marta sat on one side, Elias on the other. The archivist put on his fingerless gloves and placed the brass astrolabe on the table between them. We proceed in sequence. No simultaneous tracing until I give permission. Marta's hand trembled as she closed over her paper pad. Elias nodded and swallowed. At first the pages remained flat. The archivist recited measured prompts as he had planned. Rotate the astrolabe until the hour mark aligned with the third marginal sigil. Place your fingertips at the drawn foliate edge. Read aloud the neutral lemma. Marta performed each movement in a small, careful voice. Elias followed the motions at the opposite margin. The room held a mechanical order of tasks. The archivist recorded time and pulse with a small notebook. On the 5th minute, 2 fingers, Marta's index and Elias's middle, traced separate marginalia at once. The archivist had expressly forbidden simultaneous contact. The ink between their fingers reflowed. The surface of the page lifted, and slender strands of ink rose from the page into the space between their hands and braided themselves into a 3-dimensional lattice no larger than a palm. The archivist snatched a gloved hand back, and the glass dome fogged where his breath hit it. Stop! The curator. The archivist moved to pull the dome closed, but the lattice held its shape, suspended between the lines of script. Marta's eyes widened and she made a small sound. Elias leaned forward and mouthed a consonant as if answering. The lattice vibrated with a tone the archivist felt at the base of his skull. He wrote, ink lattice formed when simultaneous tracing occurred, in his notebook with a steady, forced stroke. The room's balance shifted. Elias' features slackened into a look the archivist had not seen in him before. Fascinated terror. Elias, I can read it now. The archivist read what? Elias. Elias whispered, a path. Coordinates for movement inside the patterns. The archivist felt his doubt and alarm tighten into a new motion, resolved to test that claim. A stray marginal glyph snapped into alignment across the table and formed a map, like overlay on the page. The archivist leaned down and saw lines converge into angles that did not correspond to measurement on any earthly plane. Elias spoke a series of low words as if naming streets. He stood back, then sat, hands braced on the table. It reads to me, Elias. It asks where to go. The archivist felt a shift again. Resolve turned to a precise hunger to know whether the glyphs could be directed rather than merely observed. The curator's hand came down on the table. You are not to perform ritualized reading, she said. We seal it or we remove it. The archivist met her eyes. We already saw interaction. If we refuse to document the mechanism, we hand it to the unknown, the curator, to the unknown or to the institution. There is a difference. Elias interrupted Marta's skin and pointed to the sheen at her wrist. The curator ordered quarantine. The archivist ignored the order long enough to take a photograph with a conservation camera. Against protocol, the archivist prepared a ritualized method he had devised from marginalia notes and the astrolabe's geometry. He set the astrolabe over the codex and aligned its brass arm with a sigil carved into the table. He arranged layered marginalia cards above the dome and placed his fingers on two particular annotations. The curator protested. Elias squeezed Marta's hand and said nothing. The archivist felt his pulse hit a steady, restrained rhythm that carried his decision. This is measured. If the manuscript responds, we record the projection and withdraw. The curator gave an ultimatum. Stop or the codex would be moved under embargo within 10 minutes. The archivist began the reading. He rotated the astrolabe and read aloud the neutral lemma while his fingertips traced the marginalia. The manuscript answered. The ink on the page separated into a ribbon of script that lifted and then folded outward, projecting a shadowed silhouette in the room. The archivist saw geometry where there had been flat strokes, a spatial hub with radial paths and tiny glyph doors along its edge. Marta convulsed and tried to speak. Elias made a sound like a small choke, and then his eyes dilated as if the room had turned inside him. Elias swore, "It is addressing me. It is addressing me by location." The archivist felt the sound as a physical vibration across his teeth. He watched the silhouette resolve into a suggested three-dimensional plan and then collapse again into ink. The curator shouted, "Seal it! Seal it now!" The archivist froze and had to decide in 3 clear heartbeats whether to reach for the astrolabe to keep the projection alive or to withdraw and comply with the order. The decision split his breath into measured, shallow pulls. He kept the astrolabe steady and whispered the closing lemma. The projection somersaulted and then stilled like a machine sent a command and then denied it. Elias sagged against the chair, incoherent for a long minute. Marta's fingers left a pattern of depressions in the table. Where the skin had touched the wood there was a faint, non-human print that did not wash away with water. The curator barked instructions into her recorder and ordered an immediate embargo. Security arrived with the seizure forms in hand. In the registry and decontamination corridor, the staff moved with protocol precision. The curator signed the seizure and issued formal notices. The archivist stood with an internal count of the time it had taken the projection to form and the precise wording Elias had used. He kept his left hand in the pocket of his robe, where the brass astrolabe chain stayed warm. Outside, the seizure truck idled like an animal. The archivist watched the codex being wrapped and carried away beneath heavy cloth, and he felt a tremor of anger that had nothing to do with the curator's authority and everything to do with the knowledge his hands had nearly touched. After the seizure, the archivist was left alone in an empty desk room by the scriptorium window. He placed a single candle against the sill and unrolled the slip of parchment he had copied moments earlier when opportunity had allowed him to mark a fragment. The copied fragment was a single sigil no larger than a fingernail, inked in his careful hand. He held it up to the light and watched the emblem dissolve into star, like motes beyond the glass. His hand shook. He had moved through suspicion, alarm, hunger, and back to a restrained dread that settled like a weight behind his eyes. He pressed the paper to the inside of his sleeve and closed his satchel. The archivist knew the curator would file a formal embargo, that Elias might not recover his clarity for some days, and that Marta would bear marks that science could not categorize. He also knew a practical fact. Institutions moved archives into inventories and sealed boxes. Knowledge did not vanish when a truck left the yard. Knowledge went into records, and records could be stolen from filing cabinets or copied in secret. The archivist stood, put on his spectacles, and ran his ink-stained fingertips along the rim of the satchel where the brass astrolabe chain pressed a crescent burn. He had a choice to make: obey the embargo and preserve his position, or pursue the Codex's language regardless of cost. He had already made an action toward it. He had copied the sigil, he had recorded Elias' phrases. He had photographed Marta's mark. The decision felt less like resolution and more like a sharpening of a tool. Outside the window, a thin light of dawn cut the stone edges of the courtyard into hard lines. The archivist folded the slip once and tucked it into a roll of parchment he kept in his inside pocket. He checked the drawer where he kept the astrolabe chain and the list of marginal cards he had drafted. The registry would log the seizure. The curator would close the file. Elias might never willingly speak of the projection again. Marta would continue to bear the mark under her sleeve. The archivist slid his hand into his satchel and felt the cool brass of the astrolabe. His final act in the room was small and concrete. He took the copied sigil, set it in the mouth of a folded leaflet, and sealed it with wax from the candle. He wrote a single, terse note in the margin of his notebook, "Copy preserved, retain access," and then replaced the notebook in the drawer. He closed the register ledger and pushed the drawer shut so that the sound echoed down the corridor. The registry door thudded as it locked. Footsteps moved in the hallway toward the seizure truck. He left the building by a side door and walked past the idling truck toward the service lane, where a maintenance man had a cigarette and did not notice him. The chapter ends with a concrete act. The archivist slides the sealed copy into his satchel, while the seizure crew explains the chain of custody to the curator, and the truck pulls away with the codex inside. He does not speak a vow or declare a new life. He takes a single, clear action that binds him to the next decision. In the quiet that follows the removal, he feels the prickle at his fingertips and the weight of the astrolabe. He has preserved an object of study that others will call contraband, and he will answer for that choice when the registry opens again. Emotion shifts in the chapter run from suspicion to alarm to controlled obsession, and finally to a restrained dread that shapes his choices. External events punctuate the narrative at regular intervals: the annex collapse, the arrival of the curator and Elias, the failed controlled test, the projection, the embargo, and the seizure truck, so that the story moves by action. Dialogue reveals conflict and motive. The archivist insists on study, the curator demands quarantine, and Elias shows the audience a way the manuscript can read back. The chapter resolves its immediate crisis by describing the seizure and the archivist's secret retention of a sigil. The institution regains control of the manuscript, but the archivist retains a fragment and a decision, and the consequences of that choice will determine whether knowledge remains a sealed archive or becomes a hazard carried home in a satchel. Marta slammed the vault door and shoved the codex onto the steel table as the ink slid away from her fingertip. Suspicion tightened the archivist's jaw. He stepped forward, palms open, and watched the strokes peel sideways, refusing a straight line under a human touch. Marta hissed and flexed her fingers. The skin across her fingertips looked paler where the ink had touched. "It moved again," she said. "It won't let me follow a line." The central problem sat on cold steel. A book that would not remain a book for human hands. The archivist had expected arguments about provenance and climate control. He had not expected the manuscript to reject a traceable reading. He wiped a smear of candle soot from his thumb, set his spectacles in place, and gave the codex a measured, clinical look as if it were an object failing a test. He remembered Marta snatching her hand back the week before when glyph strokes had slid under her fingertip in the reading wing. That event had cost them composure and led them here to the restricted conservation vault. He did not say the memory aloud. He used his voice to index facts instead. "We move it here and we control exposure." He said, "We do not let it leave the building without protocols." The word protocols sounded like armor, and suspicion guided every motion he made. Aldrich's footsteps echoed in the corridor before his shadow filled the vault entrance. "He did not knock, you brought it into the vault," Aldrich demanded. He favored the archivist with a look that counted years of stewardship as currency. "Do you understand what you risk?" Aldrich's voice carried impatience and authority. Marta answered first, short and raw. "It wouldn't have stopped changing. It burns my fingerprints, Alina, hands tucked into her sleeves, hovered behind the table with a tray of instruments and a loop. She said nothing yet, but the way she balanced the loop between forefinger and thumb made the archivist feel the problem tighten. The vault smelled of cold iron and old leather. The archivist set the codex down and tried a steadying action. He tapped the nearest marginalia with the pad of his ringed finger to see whether a practiced human gesture could coax a response. The rings were heirlooms and signets threaded with marginal motifs. He had used them while cataloging hundreds of objects. When his metal struck the paper, the glyphs rearranged like a living mosaic. A thin ridge rose along the folio. A fold clicked into place. Elena murmured, "Not preservation, interaction." The archivist felt the first emotion shift, suspicion opening into alarm. He had thought they might observe. Instead, they had provoked. Aldrich pushed closer, voice clipped, "This should be sealed. Send it to the monastery vault. Archive it where nobody reads it." Marta lifted her chin. "You want to bury it and pretend nothing happened." The argument started like a flint. They exchanged 3 blunt lines in quick succession. "Aldrich, you heard Elena. You saw the fold. I saw movement. Movement spreads. We can study it here under glass. We can control variables." The rapid back and forth paused with Marta's hand on the book's edge. Her breathing was short. Her fingers left damp crescents on the parchment. The archivist glanced at Aldrich and then at Elena. He heard the conservator's pen on her pad. Small, deliberate ticks of notes that would become evidence. "Elena, if it responds to metal and etching, we need a controlled induction. Not secrecy for safety's sake, but containment of triggers." Her voice carried the precise, cold tone of someone trained to isolate causes. They set instruments. Elena rigged a portable microscope and a trap of fine brass calipers. The archivist placed the codex on a neutral board and circled it with polymer spacers to prevent strain. Marta sat back on a low stool and watched the glyphs along the open folio. She kept her hands folded, as if the act of restraint could stop future contact. The archivist's emotions slipped again, alarm sliding into a reluctant curiosity. He himself, curiosity was scientific discipline. Marta watched him with a question in her eyes, as if asking whether curiosity would carry a cost. Elena positioned the loop. Under 30 times magnification, the ink revealed a geometry unlike any iron, gall or carbon compound she had seen. The strokes fractured into triangular lattices and nested angles, then reflected light in ways that produced a faint, internal sheen. Elena tapped her pad. "These edges refract on contact. They produce micro-reflections when disturbed by metal or friction." Her voice stayed clinical, but when she set the loop aside, her jaw was tense. The conservator's intervention produced the second external event in the middle build, a clear technical observation that changed their approach. While Elena logged measurements, the archivist rubbed his thumb along his signet ring and, without thinking, tapped the ring against the folio's margin. The sound was a single, soft metallic note. The glyphs didn't merely shift, they folded inward, and the folio rose with a small mechanical click. Marta's breath left her in a quick exhale. "Stop," she said. The archivist's fingers hovered above the page, as if suspended in a field. He felt the second emotion shift, curiosity bending into dread. Elena stepped forward, methodical. She secured a pair of cotton gloves and cleaned an area of the folio with a rarefied brush. The codex responded by aligning several loose folios so their edges matched like teeth. The arrangement formed a layered silhouette in the center of the table. Concentric bands of ink and stitched parchment produced a depth that was not flat script, but a constructed shape. Marta touched the air above it without making contact. "It wants structure," she said, "not a line to be read, but a shape to be occupied." The archivist noted the phrasing and wondered whether he heard metaphor or evidence. Aldrich would not concede. He stepped in, dismissive. "You are seeing patterns because you want to read them. None of this is a reader. It's an object," the archivist answered, short, clipped, careful. "Aldrich, stop. We observe, then decide. We do not destroy evidence because it frightens you," Marta added. "Aldrich, your fear is not a method." Their exchange sharpened. For a moment they argued as if words could stake property in truth. At noon, the light through the narrow vault slit flattened and brightened the folio. The archivist, with the rings unconsciously warmed against his skin, felt the folio transmit a sequence of small, inhuman shapes. Angles that depended on the press of metal and the orientation of marginalia etchings. The sequence was not a sentence. It had rhythm, cadence, and an abrupt cadence that made Marta flinch. The archivist made the choice he had been avoiding. He aligned his rings with the pattern and pushed his fingertips along the margins in the pattern's direction. He forced himself to complete the gesture. He tasted copper on his lip without touching anything metallic. He experienced comprehension as a physical burn. His scalp tightened, his vision tunneled, and a flood of precise, nonverbal associations ran across his mind. The sensation lasted a handful of breaths. Marta bent forward and pressed a hand to her mouth. Elena placed a careful hand on Marta's forearm to steady her. Aldrich had gone pale and retreated 2 steps. The manuscript produced a projected sequence that matched the ring pattern, and, in a moment that rearranged their working assumptions, the projected sequence resolved into a single brief address. A form that aligned to the archivist's signet and to the marginalia's motifs. The codex had performed an act the archivist had dreaded and desired. It named a reader. He did not hear the name in words. Instead, a pattern registered against his consciousness and translated into recognition. Not human nouns, but an identification keyed to his rings and the marginal itchings. The effect physically drained Marta. She sank to the stool and rubbed at her fingertips until they reddened. Elena's hands trembled while she recorded the residue that she could not yet classify. Aldrich stared at the fold and then turned away into the stacks. He left without another word. That abrupt exit became the chapter's mid-climax, the first mini-cliffhanger that altered their relationships. The archivist's immediate reaction was scientific discipline. He asked Elena to sample the residue and to photograph the folio at multiple angles. Elena did so with rapid, precise movements. "Residue is not pigment," she said. "It's a crystalline film. It reacts under heat and magnetic fields." Marta pushed a damp finger over the page and watched a pale, raised line appear across her fingertip like a salt scar. She whispered, "It remembers touch." The archivist felt guilt and responsibility converge. He had pushed the gesture. Marta had paid the cost. Aldrich returned at dusk with a small, iron-bound chest and a sealed memorandum addressed to the Board of Trustees. He placed the chest on the corridor bench and laid the memorandum over it. His voice was flat, either 20 years of safe custodianship or institutional denial. "I am taking the chest to the remote repository tonight unless you transcribe it first." The archivist read the memorandum. It argued for off-site containment in blunt policy language. Elena folded her hands around the photograph prints and said, "We can transcribe a pattern into the ledger without reproducing the manuscript's active geometry." Aldrich countered, "Transcription invites replication. The safer path is exile." The rapid argument returned, 3 lines, then another 3. "Aldrich, you will not exile it without a record. We keep no record and true copies do not exist. We record the pattern, not the trigger." They negotiated for an hour. Each line was a bargain made with professional duty and personal fear. The archivist pushed for a measured compromise. Transfer the codex in a sealed chest to the repository while creating a controlled ledger entry that recorded the emblem they had witnessed. Encoded in diagrams and inert pigment under lock, with access restricted to 3 named custodians. Aldrich wanted denial. Elena wanted the ledger's technical detail. Marta wanted the manuscript removed from anyone's hands. The archivist could see the fractures. Marta's body had been altered. Elena's trust of institutional procedure had hardened. Aldrich's instinct was to hide the problem from public accountability. They arrived at a decision by votes and refusal. Elena would transcribe the emblem into the ledger under neutral pigments that did not include metal triggers. The archivist would sign as a witness and encode a cipher that linked the pattern to a sealed note. Marta would stand guard while the apparatus prepared the transfer. Aldrich would carry the chest to the repository at dusk. They wrote formal minutes. Elena wrote a technical protocol and the archivist appended an annotation about ring resonance. The ledger line they produced was exacting. An inert diagram, cross-referenced and locked in a restricted ledger room. For the first time in days, the archivist felt a clarity that edged from dread into purpose. He had chosen containment over full comprehension, but the manuscript's naming had consequences beyond administrative choices. Marta woke that night with a sting across the tops of her fingers and a faint lattice pattern visible under the skin. She flexed, and the pattern did not shift. She went to Elena's lab the next morning. Elena held the magnifier close and said, "This is biochemical. It is embedded at the epidermis." Marta fingered the ring of her own left hand and asked, "Do I still know how to read it?" The archivist answered, "Measured, not in the way you mean. The pattern reacts. You do not possess the reader it addressed." His voice was soft. He had watched the manuscript choose someone by resonance, and the book had chosen him by accident of ring and gesture. Marta had suffered a physical reaction because she had been present during his reading. Elena added a surprising reveal. When she compared the residue samples with the photographs, she found micro etchings on the inner surface of the chest's ironwork that matched the marginalia motifs they had thought purely decorative. "Someone prepared a container already keyed to parts of the pattern," she said. "This is not a single object. It's a system that changed how they understood previous events." The chest Aldrich produced was not a neutral repository tool, but a deliberate part of an older containment ritual. The archivist felt the second required emotion shift, dread giving way to a brittle clarity. If the system existed, then the manuscript had been moved before. Someone had designed how readers might be named and how containers might respond. They confronted Aldrich with the chest's markings and the ledger. He closed his eyes and admitted a fragment of truth. The trustees had instructions long ago, sealed directives from a donor. "We applied them when dangerous items surfaced." "I followed orders." His voice did not defend. It explained. The argument between them became less about secrecy and more about responsibility. "Marta, then tell us who signed the directives." Aldrich hesitated, then named a donor and a place. "A monastery in a different province." "Elena, if directives exist, then the manuscript did not fall into our hands by accident. Someone intended for a reader to be found here." The archivist catalogued the new fact and felt it make his job larger. They had not discovered the manuscript. They had triggered a stage in a longer procedure. They resolved the manuscript's immediate physical fate. The chest would carry the codex to the remote repository under lock, escorted by Aldrich and 2 trustees who would confirm the seal. Elena would complete the ledger entry with photographs, inert diagrams, and a denotation that the pattern had reacted to metallic signets. Marta would be given medical attention and a protective sleeve for her fingers. The archivist would write a personal note and place 1 copy of the inert emblem in his private journal, not as a reading but as a reminder. He made this decision deliberately. Contain publicly, record privately. He felt the cost intimately: Marta's injury, Elena's sleeplessness, Aldrich's shame, and he accepted responsibility for the ledger's ambiguity. Before they closed the vault, the archivist performed 1 small, conscious test. He set the codex within the chest and aligned his ring against the inner ironwork. The chest responded with a quiet, metallic resonance, an echo and a lock. When Aldrich latched the chest, a thin band of dust lifted from the seam and scattered across the floor in a slow, almost deliberate drift. Marta reached to brush it away. Her hand trembled, but she swept it in a single clean stroke. The archivist locked the ledger and placed its key in a pouch. He turned the key once and the sound of the wards aligned with something he had felt under the reading table hours earlier. Recognition, but not welcome. In the final hours before they escorted the chest away, the group gathered by the scriptorium window. Light narrowed into a rectangle and fell across the archivist's hands as he wrote his final sentence in the private note. He drew the emblem carefully, using inert pigment that would not reproduce the triggering resonance. Marta stood at his elbow, watching. Elena held the photographs. Aldrich adjusted the straps on the chest. The archivist taped the ledger's page and slid it into the restricted room. He sealed his private copy in a different folder and slid it into his satchel. They did not pretend the matter was closed. The archivist closed the ledger and carried the key to the chest himself, placing it in the pouch Aldrich would take. Marta touched the pouch and then let go. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Yes," he said. His voice had the archivist's slow, measured timbre, now threaded with wariness. "We will not read it again without safer means." Alina nodded, precise. Aldrich gave no more than a curt bow of his head and walked the chest out to the cart. At the courtyard the cart waited, its iron wheels scraped by a stable hand. The archivist set the ledger upon the bench and watched Aldrich lift the chest, heavy with iron and bound leather. Marta's hands were bandaged at the fingertips. She wrapped them with a sleeve Alina had prepared. Aldrich met the archivist's eyes for a long moment, a look that contained apology, warning, and a tacit acceptance of duty. Then he put the chest onto the cart, secured the straps, and set the sealed memorandum on top. The archivist felt finality in the crunch of leather against iron and in the cart's first deliberate creak. They walked the cart to the scriptorium gate. The archivist felt every step. He had called the choice, ledger and containment over the pursuit of full comprehension. He had watched a manuscript name a reader and watched the cost fall on Marta's body. He had learned that a system of containment already existed. He had learned that institutional memory often hides as much as it protects. He had accepted those facts and arranged them into policy, notation, and action. At the gate Aldrich hesitated, then handed the pouch with the ledger key to the archivist. "Keep one copy locked here," he said. "If inquiries come, they will come through proper channels." The archivist took the pouch and felt the key's weight. He fastened the pouch to his satchel and looked at Marta. "Rest," he said. "Elena will monitor the marks." Marta nodded and breathed in through her teeth. They watched the cart move down the lane until the iron wheels became small and the chest's silhouette blurred. The archivist stood at the gate with his satchel heavy at his hip, the private copy of the emblem secure inside. He had the ledger, the key, and a name that could not be translated into human speech, but which the book had assigned by resonance. He had chosen containment over curiosity, and in that choice he had preserved the institution but compromised something personal. The single emblem in his notes would be a temptation he could not fully erase. Alone at the scriptorium window that evening, the archivist drew the emblem one more time, slower. He watched the ink dry into a small matte emblem and then set the page under glass. He pushed the ledger back into the restricted room and locked it with a measured click. Then he placed the ledger key into the pouch and buckled the pouch to his satchel, feeling the metal warm against his ribs. He left the scriptorium with the chest gone and the ledger sealed. His last action before the lamps were doused was to slide the private page into his satchel and close the flap. Outside, a cart bell chimed once in the distance. The archivist tightened his cloak and, with the pouch at his side, closed the heavy iron door of the ledger room. He turned the bolt and, with a breath that registered in the muscles of his shoulders rather than his thoughts, walked away toward the manuscript stacks. The final sound of the chapter is concrete and deliberate. The leverage of iron on wood as he latched the door and the small metallic clink of the pouch's buckle settling into place.